I actually went into this thinking, if you're writing a radio play, it's a stage play and you put in sound. Like I thought that was like the brief. And that's not true. It's somewhere between writing a screenplay and a stage play. It's my process anyway, was just writing it. Here's the story. Here's the narrative, beginning, middle, and end. Then going back and taking and looking at all the stage directions where I have movement or things like that, and thinking about, oh, people can't see this. Like what? Oh, well, here's a big thing. The big thing in my play is it's about race on some level. How do you let your audience know that one of your characters is Black? They can't see him. And you can't presume that somebody will like pick it up through their voice, or maybe even you can't presume that somebody will pick it up through the dialogue that you give them. So you have to figure out a way that in a medium where you can't see the performers, how you translate that. And that was one of the places where, when we were rehearsing this, that I looked to Parnell and Michael Shepard to sort of guide me on what would be sort of acceptable language-wise, reference-wise, who would say it, like that kind of thing, to establish that character. And I really love that challenge specifically. But yeah, so there's that, but then there's also knowing that when you change locations, like how does that manifest? Because you don't have lights up, lights down, you don't have set pieces moving on and off. All you have is sound to, let you know where you are. And so we had some talks about how do we get from place, so it's interesting. I came in writing one thing, and then my second draft was I'd gone to radio play school courtesy of Jeff Gardner, and went through and refined or changed certain elements, visual elements, into sound. Hi, I'm Sean Abley, playwright. And if you want to learn more about Antaeus Theatre Company and my zip code play, 90069 West Hollywood, Brunch Interrupted, watch this video. I fell in love with theater really, really young, like 4 or 5, I think. And we had a community theater where I grew up in Helena, Montana, and we had a community theater there called Grant Street Theater. And there was just at some point where I was driven to get involved. And I'd been doing stuff in high school, in middle school and high school before then. And I don't know, I just couldn't not do it. It just felt like this was the thing I was going to do for the rest of my life. And it was just a matter of time until I started doing it. So I got involved. I feel that I have to be part of the theater world because, wow, that's a good question. Why do I have to be part of it? I'm so driven to be part of it, but I feel like, I don't know. I think everybody has a way that their truth can come out and their true voice can manifest in the world. And for some people, it's actual art and creating art and textile art or writing, or maybe it's through, service or charitable acts or something like that. And for me, I feel that theater, my part in it, being a playwright and sort of handing over a script to a company, is the way that I get my true voice out into the world. I've always written. When I was, as soon as I could write, I was writing, and I was writing stories, and thankfully my parents saved some of them. I have these very early, very like scribbled stories that I would also illustrate as a very young person. But when I was deciding what I was going to do as, what do you want your career to be? It was an actor. And so all the way through, high school and my college undergrad was an acting BFA. I moved to Chicago to be an actor. But then when I got to Chicago, I started taking improv classes, and I realized that that's writing. Like it's just a different kind of writing. And then I started a theater company with my friends called the Factory Theater, and we just started writing shows for ourselves. And suddenly I was a playwright. And then that really actually filled me up even more than acting. And one of the reasons is you don't have to wait for someone to tell you to write. You can always write. If you're an actor, you basically have to wait for somebody to, give you the opportunity to do that. But as a writer, you can always do it. So even when you don't have something being produced, you can be working on the next thing. So then when I moved from Chicago to Los Angeles, I moved to be a writer specifically for television. And I consciously left an acting career behind. It's not that I didn't want to do it anymore. It's not that I wouldn't do it anymore. It's just that my focus at that point, that was 1997, turned to writing as my profession. So what is my process? My process, it's sort of different for every project, and it really depends on why I'm writing it. So if it's like a commission, like the zip code plays, which we'll be talking about, that was a commission, and Antaeus asked us to write short radio plays based on a zip code in the Los Angeles area. So immediately I thought about West Hollywood, because I used to live there. I lived there for 10 years, and I watched that city really, really change. So I thought, okay, if I'm going to write a play about West Hollywood, it should be about how the city has changed, what else is happening. And this was, several months ago. So we've had about a year of Black Lives Matter in the news, and, demonstrations and protests. And so being a theater artist, I feel like part of my artistic practice is arts advocacy, and it's being part of the solution in the tiny way that I can. So I looked for a way that I could involve race in this play, but from my perspective, of course, because that's not necessarily my experience. And so then it was just creating the characters. Immediately I had this in my head was two gay men of a certain age that have lived in West Hollywood the whole time, that it's been a city, and they've watched it change. And so now something is going to happen to make them have to deal with each other in the context of that change. So then I started with characters, and then I chose a bar that has unfortunately gone out of business during the pandemic, but I wanted to sort of preserve it in amber. So I put it in the play. And then then it just sort of fell into place, quite frankly. Writing. So I guess the main answer to your question is it's based on character. So once I've decided I'm going to write a play, once I'm assigned a play, or I just choose to write a play, I build the characters, and then figure out how they relate to the environment that I'm writing in. So I heard about Antaeus. It's sort of a long route. I had decided to get my MFA I'm a returning student, as they say. I decided to get my MFA, and I started that process in my late 40s, and ultimately got it after I turned 50. And during that process, I had two plays that went to the Kennedy Center as part of the American College Theater Festival. And they were both nominated for some national awards. And in that process, I met a woman named Jeanette Farr Harkins, and she was one of the respondents to my plays. And it just so happened that she lived in Los Angeles, and she was a part of the Antaeus Playwrights Lab. So when we got back, like a good networker that I am, I reached out to her. I was like, let's have lunch. And just through the course of that, she mentioned this playwriting lab that she was in that she really loved, and invited me to come check it out. And it just so happened to be part of this company that I knew about that does amazing work. They do the classics mostly. And so it was sort of a surprise that they had a playwrights lab. And then I went, and the first night I was there, I heard all of this amazing work by some of the playwrights in the lab. And I was like, how can I be part of this? And that just started the process of, basically applying, submitting work, and eventually getting accepted into the lab. And that was 3 years ago, I think, at this point. One of the things that is really great about Antaeus is that as I've been in the company, even in the short time, like 3 years, they have instituted more and more outlets for the playwrights to create. So we've been doing some 10-minute play festivals internally, and they have a reading series called Lab Results. And once the pandemic started and basically live theater shut down, they were looking for ways to keep all the artists, the playwrights and the actors, employed basically. And they came up with this, instead of Zoom theater, they came up with this great idea for radio theater. So it's not we're not like compromising our work by putting it on Zoom. We're actually writing for a medium correctly. So they did round one of they just reached out to the lab and said, who wants to be involved? We're going to pick 6 writers and we'll go from there. And so I wasn't in the first season, as they're calling it. And then the second season rolled around and I threw my hat in the ring and they chose me. And honestly, having heard the first season, I'd never written for radio before, or radio drama. It really, I'm glad that I wasn't in the first one, because the playwrights they chose for the first one were so good, and the post-production and the sound was so amazing that then I had the advantage of having all of that as an example. So yeah, so they reached out to us and we said yes. My piece is called Brunch Interrupted. I lived in West Hollywood for 10 years. I watched the city during those 10 years change. And then I live now in Hollywood with my husband, and we've lived in this place for 17 years now, but still, connected to West Hollywood, and I'm there a lot. And a thing that's happening with West Hollywood is it's being sort of colonized by straight people. It was a city that was formed with gay interests in mind, and it was, where the majority of gay bars were in the Los Angeles area, and they had, domestic partnership early, and the city council is, queer people. And so it was this sort of thriving gay metropolis. I mean, people know it all over the country. When you say West Hollywood, they immediately know what you're talking about. But what started happening was the city started getting sold to the highest bidder, and development started happening in the city, and it wasn't necessarily queer centric, and queer businesses were closing because they couldn't afford the rents anymore. I mean, the church, the gay church, moved out of its West Hollywood location because it couldn't afford the rent anymore. And I just thought that was a shame. And so when it came time to write a play about an area, and and I'm always sort of looking for an angle where it can be something more than just a play. It can maybe, be a statement about something. That was forefront in my mind. And so the kickoff of the play is, people at a gay bar being confronted by a straight woman who has moved into West Hollywood complaining about noise at a bar. Well, the gay people aren't complaining about noise at the bar. Like that's our thing, right? And then the next thing that I wanted to do is, being a responsible and responsive artist to what's going on in the world right now, I wanted to try to make space for characters of color and artists of color that could be involved. So after initially sort of looking at this problem of straight colonization in West Hollywood, it sort of came to me that if, West Hollywood is a pretty white city, let's be frank. And if you were one of the few Black queer people living in that city, would more white people coming to the city really make that much of a difference? Like, would it matter that they're straight? It would probably matter more that it's just more white influence in a place where you are outnumbered. So, treading very carefully, I decided to make that sort of the crux of my story, that the white character is, their limited experience says, oh, a bunch of straight people are moving into the city and that's bad. And the Black character saying, there's a different viewpoint here that you're not considering because of your limited experience. And, and that happens in a couple. And I wanted to explore when a white person is asked the tough questions, how do they respond? And because I can't do it from the Black perspective, because that's not me, that's not my lived experience, but I can certainly do it from the perspective of a white person who has been challenged and feeling defensive and not knowing how to answer the right way, and then further sort of be of service to the solution. So I set that challenge for myself in this, 20-minute radio play. And, I reached out to a friend of mine, Michael Shepard, who is a director and an artistic director of the gay theater in town, Celebration Theater. And he's also a Black man who I have collaborated with for many, many years. And my friend Parnell Damone, who's a Black actor who I've also collaborated with. And I was humbly handed them this work. And I'm like, please tell me, what, am I on the mark? Am I out of my lane? Whatever. And I think we, I don't know, it's not, I don't want to say it's a perfect solution, but I feel like it's a good start. So the story of Brunch Interrupted is, it begins in the parking lot of the Gold Coast Bar, which is, if you know the Gold Coast Bar, you know that they host this red dress party every year, or they did. Unfortunately, they've closed. But they used to hold a red dress party in their parking lot every year. And it was a charitable event. And, it got pretty raucous. So what's happening at the beginning is the two main characters are Joe and Moses, a couple, interracial couple, are setting up for this red dress party. And there's music playing in the bar. And it's loud music. And a white woman who lives in the neighborhood approaches them to complain about the noise. And turns out she's complained several times about the noise, about this bar. And thus starts a conversation with this woman and her entitlement to living in a quiet neighborhood in a city that was not necessarily built for her. They have an argument, and the interracial couple, they sort of settle it in the moment, and the couple goes off to go have brunch. And while they're at brunch, the two of them start talking about this invasion of straight people into West Hollywood. And Moses, who's the Black gentleman of the couple, is not so, worried about more straight people. He's actually more concerned that city's just getting whiter. And Joe, his partner, thinks that he understands, but he's quickly sort of disabused of that notion that he is making the right considerations in this argument. And while they're, as a couple sort of working through that, the woman shows up at their brunch. So once again, she's sort of invading gay space. And the three of them have a discussion that it doesn't solve all the problems because, these are messy issues, but it does help them all understand a little bit more about who's affected and what the stakes are. I am blessed with an amazing team of people on this project, and I pinch myself, quite frankly. When I was writing it, I wrote this piece for certain actors. So I'll just start with Bill Brocktrup, who is the co-artistic director of Antaeus Theatre Company. And I in my head, I always had his voice as I was writing the script, but he's the co-artistic director and he's making the decisions, sort of who's doing these things and who's getting cast and stuff like that. So he wanted to be very careful not to be like, I'm going to take this plum role for myself. But I was like, I got to have you. I really got to have you. And I've been watching Bill for decades, and he's so talented, and I've seen him on stage and I've seen him on screen. And I mean, just like A+ for casting for this. And I got him, and he is great. And part of the way I got him was Michael Shepard, who's the director, who is also the artistic director of Celebration Theater here in Los Angeles. But we've known each other since our Chicago theater days 30 years ago. So we've known each other forever. And, he was my first choice to direct this. And when we got him on board, this was before we cast anything, I was like, I want Bill. And he's like, I think Bill would be perfect. And Bill was like, I don't know. I may, and we're both like, no, we have to have you. And so he relented, and I'm so happy he did, because he's so good. So Michael I've worked with forever, and I knew that if I handed something like this to him as, a Black theater artist who has been fighting the good fight his entire career, he would not be shy about telling me where maybe this didn't hit the mark, or, was I just completely out of bounds, like even trying to write this, like, he would be honest with me. So, already now we've established like a chunk of the dream team. Playing opposite Bill is another friend of mine, playing Moses, the Black half of the interracial couple, is Parnell Damone. And Parnell is also, I met him through Celebration Theater, and I don't know, we've just we've hit it off ages ago. And so I've had him, like, when I write a script, frequently I'll just like call actors to come in and like read just so I can hear it. I've had him do those things. And so yeah, it was really great that we could like get him, and he and Michael have worked together forever. So that was, again, it's like old home week with this. Like, there was no surprises. I got to just work with these people that I've known and respect so much. And Parnell also, good friend. And I trusted him to like, tell me the truth about this piece. And then, so the woman in the piece, there's 3 actors. The woman in the piece is an older white woman who lives in the neighborhood. And there is this amazing actor at Antaeus named Angie Bird. And if anybody has like worked at Antaeus, or anybody in the Playwrights Lab that's hearing me talk about this, they are right now nodding in agreement that she's magnificent actor. And I write for her when I write, like every time I write a little 10-minute piece or anything, I write for Angie Bird. And, the competition's stiff in these things. There's 6 playwrights that are trying to cast their play. And, when I wrote it, I had her voice in mind, and I was like, I need this actor. And I got her. I could not have been happier. She's so good. So then at that point, I'm like, well, I can't lose. Like, this is, front loaded to be amazing. And then the first time they read it was like, magic. So, and then the sort of, the icing on, I was going to say the icing on the cake, but actually it's not the icing on the cake. It's like the cake. Everything else is the icing. Jeff Gardner, who is the sound guru, he does so many things. I know that like each one of them would have a name for the position, for what it is, but since he's like doing it all, sound guru, sound wizard, sound magician. And, I didn't know him personally before I, listened to the first season of these plays. But I've heard his work on the various stage readings and things that are broadcast around town. And I didn't know who that was, but then I heard his work on the previous Zip Code plays, and somebody said his name, and then I met him, and he started talking about his credits. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've heard your work for years in Los Angeles. And the meeting with him, when we just went through the script and he would bring things up, and I'm like, oh, right, that has a sound to it. Yeah, he just had such like, why am I saying he's a pro? Like, why would I even think differently? But he opened my eyes to like the choices that you need to make when you write something like this. So in this whole process, the biggest education I got was from him in how to write toward the medium, and then think creatively within that to sort of get past just footsteps, you know what I mean? Or just like doors opening, like think of the smaller details that really create a world in radio theater. I think what I want the audience to get out of my Zip Code play is it changed from when I started writing it to today. And I think that the big thing I want to get people to get out of it is that it is a person's personal responsibility to acknowledge another person's lived experience, to acknowledge that that is valid. It's not your responsibility to understand it 100%. It's not your responsibility to live it. It's not your responsibility really to do anything other than acknowledge that it's real. And in doing that, you give that person the space they need to move about in life, with your support. Now, there's obviously action items I feel that, we can do as allies for each other. And those are situational, absolutely. But I think the one main one is you just have to acknowledge that someone else is real. And just because you don't understand it and you haven't lived it doesn't mean that it's not valid and not important, and possibly not more important than your own. So that's what I would hope people would get out of it. And, you know, if it's, everybody wants like, oh, I hope it starts a conversation. I hope it starts more than a conversation, but it'll start with a conversation. I'm not necessarily looking to change the world, but I am sort of looking to change people's minds. So one of the things, when I wrote this play, and this is just particular to me as a playwright, I always have my eye on something having a longer life than just the one production. So even though this is sort of specific for radio theater, in my head, as soon as this is done, there'll be a version of it that can be done on stage. So I don't want to say it'll be take a step backwards, but it'll be, figuring out how the stuff that I felt needed to be translated to sound can then be sort of switched back to visual for the most part. And yeah, I mean, I would love to see it, like, it's kind of killed me not to actually be watching them record it. So yeah, I would love to see it on stage at some point. One of the great things about being involved in this project and just having the Zip Code plays exist is getting to look at the Los Angeles area where I've lived for over 20 years. I've lived here longer than I've lived anywhere else in my life. But I haven't, it's so spread out, I haven't seen it all still. And one of the great things about just the fact that they exist is that I get to dip into all these areas that I may not have, be super invested in already. But also the Antaeus's commitment to diversity and inclusion in the artists involved means that I get to hear people's work, both playwrights, actors, sound, directing, from a really broad spectrum of people, of creators. And I get to have it all in sort of one place. And I think that's really exciting. So one of the things that Antaeus is doing is these walking tours of the zip codes that are in the Zip Code plays. And I would love for one for West Hollywood. Certainly there are some fun places to like discover in West Hollywood. And certainly there are some places that, let's just say that the straight world may not be quite as privy to in West Hollywood, that I would love to let them know about. Yeah, like I said earlier, that there's something about West Hollywood where it's sort of in a medium state of crisis, in that the culture of it is slowly being eroded. And so any way that we can keep that, record that, like preserve that in amber would be great. So yeah, a walking tour. You have a lot of choices when, for your entertainment these days. And there's, 500 channels on TV. And even though the movie theaters are closed right now, they are, you can still watch every movie that's ever been released and every TV show. And there's, what you don't have a lot of chances to do, or just at least fewer, is to support theater companies. And, theater has taken a real hit over the last year. And so this is a really easy way to support a company who's committed to keeping artists employed. And so there's that. You can do it from the comfort of your own home. You can do it in your car. You can do it wherever. There's also just the fact that how often do you listen to radio drama? How often do you really listen to radio drama? And now you've got the perfect way to give it a try. We listen to books on tape and we listen to, like the murder podcasts and all that stuff. But, these bite-sized 20-minute or so full plays, beginning, middle, and end with really great actors. Why not? It's a great way to spend some time and support a theater company, expose yourself to a different artistic medium, and they're really good. It feels just so obvious to me, and yet frustrating that we're at this point and it's not true, that art is for everyone, literally for everyone. It should be for everyone. It should speak to everyone. You must have art in your life. I just believe that with my very heart and soul, but it's so hard to instill a love of art into someone if that art isn't reflecting them back to themselves in some way. I feel like when an artist creates art, any art, that artist is confessing. And there are people that can take your confession and internalize it and make it part of themselves. Like you've given them part of yourself and your lived experience, and now they have it and they can take it and they can, do whatever they want with it. But if you're speaking to someone that can't take that in or can't take it in as easily, then I don't want to say the art is wasted, but it's an uphill climb. And it's also not authentic, right? Like, the whole idea of colonizing, the whole idea of, a culture taking over another one and just like force feeding it its own specific thing while ignoring what it has to offer. And this goes both ways, right? Like we certainly have artists of color. I mean, literally, like white men are the gatekeepers of theater in this country. And because of that, even if we don't want to be, we are. And because of that, what gets through that gate doesn't speak to everyone. And so the community, the arts are always bemoaning the fact that we don't have enough people supporting us and enough money in the arts. But why would there be? Like, why would I give money to something that is not speaking to me and doesn't want to speak to me? So there's that aspect of it. But also just for like health reasons, I can't say enough about how important I think art is in a person's life. And when I think of, they say that, a person sticks with theater as a, a thing that they choose for entertainment if they're exposed to it as a child. But if what you're exposed to as a child is basically a foreign language, why would you stick with it, right? And so I just think it is imperative right now that those of us that have the, capital in this art form that we call theater, spend it in a way, not even spend it, give it away to people that need it. And that is, the communities of color that are underserved. Basically any community that's underserved, like, the community of people that have like neurological challenges, like neurodivergent, like, people with physical challenges, and like they are not represented. And I think as a society, we're healthier when everybody has that in their life in a way that speaks to them. And it goes both ways. Like, as much as I want to be like, here, please take my space, let me get out of the way, like whatever I can do. I also should be taking that in. Like, if you're the dominant culture, you've been feeding all the other cultures your specific thing. They are well versed. It's that whole argument, like who can tell whose stories. And, as a white writer, I'm not going to write a story of I'm not going to take like a historical Black figure and write a play. But Black writers, Asian writers, Latino writers, they can do that for, like Hamilton. They can do that because they've been force-fed white culture there, like from the minute they've taken a breath. It only benefits me to turn that around. Like it only makes me a better artist to consume this art that is not necessarily, my colony. So yeah, it frustrates me that we're at this point. It excites me that we're at this point now, though, because it feels like something is happening, and I think it's going to take longer than we think it will. But I feel like we are making steps in the right direction. I'm not the one to gauge that, though, like because again, I am the community that's sort of set. I know that Antaeus is really, really, really committed to being part of the solution, and they have been doing the tough work and the recruiting and the bringing in of more people to the company. So yeah, so I don't know. To me, it just feels like a no-brainer. But I understand that's silly of me to think that everybody would just be on board with that. But I don't know. I think it's our responsibility to make it happen, and it can only be for the better. Like what could possibly be the downside of having more diverse voices in theater? I couldn't even pretend to make one up. Antaeus Theatre Playwrights Lab, Antaeus Theatre Playwrights Lab. It's interesting because it's changed even since I've been in it. And I know, it's got a long storied history that having been a member of like 3 to 4 years, I don't know all of it, but I've watched it change from a place where, playwrights bring in their work. And I've always called it the smartest room in Los Angeles as far as like theater, as far as play critique goes. It's changed from just that, which I mean, that alone is some of the best working playwrights in Los Angeles are workshopping work in our lab, to a group that's very aware of what we can do to be part of the solution when it comes to what's happening in theater right now. And mostly that's just applauding efforts to make space for everyone, and really leaning into playwrights' voices that are different than yours. And I think it's becoming more important to the company, interestingly, because when I first joined the lab, there was no expectation of production. They didn't, they were like, we do the classics. This is another thing that we do just, for playwrights to workshop their work and for the actors to, work out and do cold reads. But then there were a couple plays, Stephanie Walker's The Abuelas and Jennifer Maisel's 8 Nights. I hope I'm getting both those titles names right. Sort of rose up through all of it, and Antaeus decided to produce them in full productions. And now suddenly there's, the stuff that's being workshopped in the lab is actually like being seen as worthy of breaking their mission statement of doing the classics and producing these new works. And I think that at that moment, the stakes changed, and the company started this thing called Lab Results, which is plays that have been workshopped in the playwrights lab that are then read in staged readings for the public. And, for that, it's finding directors from the outside and casting with the ensemble, the acting ensemble, and, presenting new work to the public and to the subscriber base. And that, there's not a ton of new play development in Los Angeles, certainly not as much as in other cities. I mean, there is some. I don't want to downplay some of the great stuff that's going on in the city as far as like stage readings and things like that. But Antaeus is definitely part of that, and I think really pushing that forward. And I think more theater is never a bad thing, right? Like more good plays are never a bad thing. And so now, so we've sort of turned the corner from just a place where you bring in pages to read to a place where you really have an eye on what can I do with this play to get it production ready in some form or another, plus how can I be of service to playwrights that aren't like me in this process as well. And that's, I think, incredibly important. There's some things going on at Antaeus that have sort of grown out of the lab that I'm not necessarily at liberty to talk about yet, but they are, the next step. Like there's still this pipeline as far as like what our plays do. We've done a little bit of a renovation of how lab works, and so now we have some framework in place that sort of solidifies this development process. And again, that will be made much more evident later on in the 21-22 season, I believe. And more ways for talented writers to get paid to make art. So, sorry for the lack of specifics, but I think that in general, we're lucky that we have some really generous benefactors at the theater that give us the resources to continue this development process, which isn't always cheap. I think the playwrights and the acting ensemble just really benefit from it. And ultimately, theaters that get their hands on these plays are going to benefit from it too. One of the things I love about this theater company, about Antaeus, is that as a playwright, actors are reading my work that I have watched for years, that have stellar reputations and resumes, like taking my pages, Sean Abley's pages that he's just typed up and are super raw, and like giving it the polish that they may or may not deserve. The last thing that I presented in lab was a 10-minute play, and one of the actors that read one of the roles, I believe, won a Tony on Broadway. I mean, he's been on Broadway a bunch of times, and I believe won a Tony. I think correctly. I mean, like that right there should be enough to get playwrights involved in this company. So the acting ensemble there's sort of two parts to it. There's the membership, so it's a membership company, and then we have Playwrights Lab actors who are not members of the main company, but they are sort of all come together to do the readings for the plays. And I'm not sure exactly how we find our lab actors. I do think there's some recruiting from the classes. So Antaeus also teaches classes. They teach acting classes. They teach, analysis classes, reading classes, like all this, like brilliant theater artists, being of service as teachers. And that's a great way to get involved, is if you're a performer, is through that route. For playwrights, it's literally just submitting. Like you can come as a guest. I mean, right now we're in Zoom theater land, so it's a little more difficult. But when it's in real times, the best way is just, meet a lab playwright and be able to say, I'm interested, and they can just bring you to lab and you can watch. That's how I got in. And I've been there for 3 to 4 years. So there's more opportunity for playwrights to develop work in Los Angeles than a lot of people realize. And there's a lot of really great ways to do that. And so I don't want to like compare and contrast and be like, ours is the best, but what Antaeus has to offer is amazing. And it's supported from the top down. Like I literally have the ear of the executive director and the co-artistic directors, and they are hands-on with all of this stuff. So it's not sort of a little side project of the company. It is a thing that is thriving and becoming more important by the day. In, Los Angeles or any other city, you have your choice usually of some giant theater company and or medium-sized theaters and like really small theaters. And companies like Antaeus, which are, I would say, like the medium-sized theater, right? They're not, Center Theater Group. They're not the Taper, but they're not, a storefront. They are, a solid, 99-seat theater. That's where the new work is getting done. Like that's where exciting new stuff is happening. Like before ends up on like, even off Broadway, it's happening in theaters that are the size of Antaeus. And those they don't just magically happen. So if you're looking for, a way to support something charitably, either by your presence or your money, choose theater, choose, medium-sized theaters in Los Angeles. I can't speak for a lot of theaters, but what I can say for Antaeus is that they actively looked for ways to keep us all engaged during the last year. And I think that is important. And I think that should be rewarded, honestly, with your presence and your subscriptions and your money and your excitement about it. We really are just looking for every way that we can to be a positive force, both socially and artistically. And that helps everybody. So, if you have the time or the money or the interest, send it our way. We could absolutely use it. If you liked listening to me prattle on about my play and various other things in theater, you can check out my Zip Code play and all the rest of the Zip Code plays from both season 1 and season 2 at antaeus.org. There's also a lot of ways that if you want to support our theater, that you can donate, and you can sign up for our newsletter, and we'll let you know the minute you can walk back into the actual building. But in the meantime, please enjoy the Zip Code Plays Season 2 wherever you get your podcasts or radio dramas.